I knew a month ago that I was on to do the Men of Faith talk tonight, and somehow a month disappeared. And in the past 2 days, was thinking, what can I do for a Men of Faith talk? What can I actually talk about? And then it struck me, why don't I just talk about men of faith? Because that's something that we all strive to be. And, what better way to look at what we should be and what characteristics we should have and how we should love our lives, other than actually looking at some of the men that were in the life of Jesus. There is quite a lot of them, and I actually only did three of them for tonight. In the future, I could possibly carry on and look at a couple of others. So for tonight, we'll just be looking at three men that are in Jesus' life and what we can kind of take from them and apply to our own lives. Because, I feel like we're all in quite a fortunate position. We get to learn about these people in scripture, characters that spent their time with Jesus, they walked with him daily, and some even just had brief interactions with him. But we can look at them and we can kind of cherry pick which lessons of their lives we want to use and apply to our own lives. And I know I have, I'm not sure about you, but have you ever wondered what it would have actually been like to be one of these men? To not be looking back at a story that you're reading and thinking, oh, I would have done better, or I would have said the right thing, or I would have acted differently, or I would have done the same thing because that was the right thing to do. Where in reality, I think most of us have not really had to face the same decisions and circumstances that these people have. And in the heat of the moment, probably we wouldn't have come out for the better of it. So I want to look at some of these characters. I want to look at some of these men and the situations that they were in and what their kind of relationship was with Jesus and what kind of faith they had. And of course, then what we can use that, the lessons from that for, and how we can apply that to our lives. So the first character and person I would like to look at is Matthew. Matthew chapter 9. I'll read that on your screens as well. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. In today's world, we're no strangers to mass public appeal. We have social media where people amass thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers. And, on our phones, there's constant broadcast messages that are sent out to hundreds of people at one go. And there's just this overwhelming amount of importance being put on being able to contact anyone and everyone at any time. And that is quite a stark contrast to in Jesus' time, but especially Jesus, who always called his disciples one by one. He wasn't just going up, standing on a hill and shouting to, the large group of people saying, hey, anyone that wants to follow me and become a disciple, you come on ahead and, you'll be a special disciple to me. He went and he kind of handpicked a couple of people. And we read from this passage here that Matthew is a tax collector, and not much has changed in the sense that from Bible times till today, a tax collector, he's not really anyone's favorite person. They kind of have bad reputations. And, who wants to be a friend of someone who, could absolutely financially ruin you? Someone who's watching every dime you make and every dime you spend. And, it would be one thing if they were all honest people, but especially in those times, they weren't. And they had this reputation of being a bit corrupt and a bit shady and getting things for their own gain. And no one really wanted to be around them, except, of course, Jesus. You know, Jesus knew who Matthew was. He knew him in his sin as a tax collector. He knew where he was in his life at that stage. And Jesus called him to follow him, and Matthew did. He didn't have to fix his life first and clean it up and change his profession to follow Christ. But we know as a result of following Christ, things changed for him. And it's the same for us. After his conversion to becoming a follower, the next scene in this chapter shows Jesus and his disciples at Matthew's home for dinner. And it's not just a one-on-one dinner with only Matthew and Jesus, but there's these other tax collectors and sinners as well, and the Pharisees there as well. And the disciples are asked by these Pharisees, why is Jesus eating with these sinners? And, you know, Jesus explains that he's there for the sick and not the healthy. He's there for the sinners, not the righteous. Now, some things that I've learned from Matthew is he was very obedient, especially here right at the start. You know, all of us are called by God to have this relationship with him the way that Jesus called Matthew. We are chosen by God to be saved, all of us. And interestingly, Matthew didn't have to choose Jesus back, though. Jesus could have said, I want you to follow me. And he could have said, Oh, I don't want to. I like my life. I don't feel like I can do that right now. But he was obedient to the Lord. When we are called, that is what we must do. We must immediately follow. And not only for, our salvation and being baptized, but it's whether we are going to minister or go and do outreach or preach the gospel. We might be called to a mission field, whether it's somewhere local or maybe even overseas. We might feel like we're being called to teach a Sunday school or something quite simple like that. Maybe we're just being called to reach out to a couple of friends around us. I also feel like I learned that Matthew had courage, because what did it take on Matthew's part to stop what he was doing and to follow Jesus? He was a tax collector, so he was probably quite wealthy. He was also probably quite smart, and he could have probably reasoned, why he should not follow Christ. But he was willing to give it all up. He was willing to risk what his friends might have thought. And I think deep down inside, Jesus may have looked at this man sitting there at this table, counting these coins, and seen that deep down inside, Matthew was unhappy. He knew the way his life was going wasn't working. It wasn't what he wanted from life. From the outside, he may have looked happy and wealthy, but something was missing from his life. And that thing that was missing is probably something that Jesus would be able to give him, or at least give him the answer as to what he was wanting. A new life, a life with Christ, a life filled with peace and direction and purpose, a life that is different to what he was busy with when it comes to the money and the ways of the world. And in a sense, isn't that really what we all want from life as well? Not to be stressed out, not to be so concerned about our success and, what we look like to those around us, but to just have this peace and to be content with our relationship with God. Matthew got up immediately and followed Jesus. It doesn't say that he thought about it for a week before making his decision. And in our lives, sometimes there's still something that holds us back from God. there might be something that we're not wanting to give up just yet. It might be an addiction or an attitude, ego that we're trying to maintain, this image we have with our friends. Or maybe it's a friend that we care about who is a bad influence. Are we willing to immediately get up and follow Jesus when we are called to do so? Philippians 1 verses 20 says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or death. So let us have the courage that Matthew showed, and that we will not be ashamed by the world for answering the call. Matthew teaches us about hospitality. Our homes, they are not just for us to enjoy, but we are meant to share them. And I feel like, Christian hospitality, it's not so much to do with what we have, but more to do with who we are. Personally, I've been in the fortunate position enough to enjoy the hospitality of many brothers and sisters in the truth. And I've stayed in the most basic of dwellings in rural parts of Africa with walls made of mud. But also, on the other hand, I've been in beautiful, large homes while traveling abroad, with air conditioned rooms and heated swimming pools. And, you know, even though there's this really stark contrast between, the important part, though, is that the fellowship and the hospitality has always been warm and welcoming inside those homes. Matthew teaches us that there's this importance of opening our homes to not just those that are already in the truth and only trusting those that we know, oh, they've now chosen to follow Jesus as well, but also the lost, the ones who are strangers to God at that stage in their lives. We never know the impact that we will make on their lives by inviting them in. We've just recently actually met someone through our brother Gideon, and we were fortunate enough to have him back at our homes for lunch and fellowship. And just seeing how much the whole group enjoyed this afternoon with new company reminded me that it's so important to just continuously bring new people into our lives and show them this character and love of Christ. Luke 14, verses 12 to 14 reads, Then Jesus said to his host, When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors, because if you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So we are blessed when we invite those into our homes with hospitality. Matthew taught me about following Christ. Now, we know he was a disciple and we know he was willing to be known as a follower of Christ. And when he opened up his home, he was announcing his allegiance to Christ. He had all of these other tax collectors, these other people who were probably his friends there with him. So he took the risk of what that meant. He was even asked this question of, why his teacher, this new teacher of his, would even eat with these tax collectors and sinners. And it was maybe not to ask him personally as a tax collector, but, he was there when this question was asked. And it was probably an opportunity for him to have to answer at a point, that he had to either let his yes be yes or his no be no. He either had to say, yes, I am a disciple. This is my teacher. This is the direction I'm going. Or no, I'm just hosting him for this evening and I'm going to move on. He couldn't be on the fence when he was asked this question. There might be some areas in our own lives where we are still on the fence. If we were in a public place and questioned, would we be willing to say who we followed? Would we, when we're on an airplane or in a waiting room at the doctor's office or in our workplace, or if we at the gym, if we were to hear a maybe off-colored joke or get an email or message that was a bit crude, or you know something that someone says, oh, we want to go see this movie that's quite inappropriate, would we be willing to stand our ground and say who we are following? Would we align ourselves with Christ and stand up for that? And don't get me wrong, there are times where we stay under the radar and we kind of wait for an opportunity to share our faith, when the timing is right. But I'm not talking about those moments. I'm just saying, Matthew, in this particular time, in this specific moment, he was put out in front of his friends, in front of people who knew him, and was asked who he was following. And he, I believe, was able to admit and say with conviction that Jesus was his new teacher. Lastly, with Matthew, he taught me what Jesus's real purpose is. And that dinner, just as there was an opportunity for him to announce who he was following, you know, it was a place to announce Jesus's purpose in his life. There are lunches we go to, or we have some, coffee meetings with friends, or we might meet someone at the gym, or there's games nights we have with our friends, or at work we have conversations with coworkers. All these places where we meet people, where we have groups of people, it's all possibly for the purpose of the kingdom. Jesus came for the lost, for the sick, for the empty, and those who had not found him. But if we only have dinners and these games nights and only go golfing or shopping, whatever the case is, with people who are already saved, with fellow believers, how are we ever going to reach the lost? Are having times with friends in the truth important? Yes, they are, definitely. But, you know, we must not live in this box with everyone around us who is just like us. First, we won't grow because our measurement becomes each other. So if we're all just the same, none of us will sharpen each other and grow in our truth. We need to be able to be with those who we need to strengthen, those who we need to teach. And then our relationship with God will also grow stronger. But, you know, we need to be, again, like Matthew, obedient to God's calling and to his word. And we need to follow Christ and do what is God's purpose, which is spreading the gospel, reaching out to those who need to hear it. Jesus didn't worry about what people thought about him, about who he associated with, whether it was these tax collectors or the sinners. He knew what his purpose was on earth. And in the same way, we need to know what our purpose is as well, just like Matthew found his. The second character I'd like to look at is Peter. Uh, in the book of Matthew 14, verse 22 to 23 to 33, we read, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid.' 'Lord, if it is you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Throughout the Bible and reading about Peter, I've always found him quite a wonderful example of a follower of Jesus that we can relate to. His journey had so many ups and downs. He's known for being the rock that Jesus will build the church on, but then he's also got these shortcomings, having doubt in the storm and denying Jesus. And with a life so full of different experiences and reactions and outcomes, it's quite easy to take parts of our lives and compare it to his life. And a couple of things that I've learned from Peter is firstly, especially from this passage here where he's stepping out of the boat, that, you know, God allowed Peter to get into situations that seem hopeless. When Peter and the disciples were now in the sea here on their boat, they were kind of lost in the storm. Their boat was a bit directionless and adrift and at the mercy of the storm, with the wind buffeting against them and catching the sails. And I can imagine them, having this struggle, not quite getting to where they want to go. And I think sometimes, God will allow us to fall into situations that seem a bit directionless, situations that could scare us. But this is because he wants us to choose him over our situation, to trust in him and not ourselves. But Peter here knew that Jesus' voice brought safety. Like the other disciples, he knew Jesus' voice because he spent every day with him. And I feel like in our own lives, with our own uh, relationship with Jesus, we have to know Jesus' voice in order to grow in our relationship. We have to hear and listen for this voice. And when we do recognize his voice calling to us in certain directions, that would be by studying his word and, being diligent in prayer. And we need to be able to discern between our own voice in our head, wanting earthly things, and Jesus' voice calling in our lives. Now, at first over here, Peter and the other disciples, they were afraid of the storm. And on top of that, they then see this figure walking on the water appearing to be a ghost, it says. Now, if you were in that situation, would you not probably think the same thing when you're so caught up in what's going on around you in this terrifying storm? But as soon as Jesus spoke, they became a bit more calm. They could trust in who he is. They could trust in their safety, having faith in him having control over the situation. So sometimes when we're in the midst of a storm in our lives, we need to just be calm enough to listen to hear his voice. We need to bring ourselves out from what's happening in our lives, come to the scripture to read, to see what's going on, to pray, to have fellowship with other brothers and sisters, to calm us and to find our direction to Christ. Peter does a very interesting thing here, where he made a choice. He followed Jesus even when it led him into a storm. So he was on the boat. And you would think being on the boat is safer than being in the water when you're thinking about a storm, such as what they were in. And sometimes we might have to make choices to do what God wants us to do, even when we know it will be hard. Maybe we have to break up with someone or dissolve a friendship or move to a new city or change our jobs. We might have to confront someone who's hurt us, or, we might be facing a life-threatening disease. But, no matter what it is, God has allowed it to happen in our lives. But he also reminds us that he is with us in and through the storms we're going through. Going through a storm, trusting in God makes us stronger, and it also helps um, those who are around us when they see what we're going through to be encouraged that when they might face a similar storm after us, that we can be there for them as well. Throughout the Gospels, Peter is known for his assertiveness. You know, Peter's interactions with Jesus and the disciples, they reflect a leader who is impulsive and ambitious. He's, like I said, assertive, and he's very quick to commit fully without, you know, commit without fully understanding the meaning of, what Jesus is asking. And nowhere does it show it more than right here in this situation, because he sees Jesus walking on the water and immediately says, "Hey, I want to walk on the water too. If you can do it, Lord, then surely I can do it too if I am your disciple, if I am your follower," right? Now, being so ambitious and impulsive and assertive, it can be used to bring glory to God. Because, oftentimes when we're like that, we're willing to step out of our comfort zone. We're willing to say something when no one else will. God gave some of us this gift of assertiveness to be used to bring others to Christ. Maybe God has given you a personality that is, um, you're an extrovert, and that is so that you can speak up for your beliefs, to call out to others, to stand up for those who are unable to speak for themselves. So we need to use that kind of assertiveness for the right reasons. Psalms 19, verses 14 says, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." So let our words of our mouths always be pleasing to God and be for his glory. Now, I know that we've all probably heard 100 studies on Peter getting out of the boat, of how he at least he did get out of the boat when others didn't, but there is so much more here than just Peter getting out of the boat. He believed he would be safe because he trusted in Jesus. And you can't build trust in Jesus without first spending time with him. Just like you cannot trust in people without first spending time with them. So Peter, when he got out of that boat, he didn't have to doubt. He knew who Jesus was. And in the same way, do we spend enough time with Jesus through our Bible study and our prayer to totally trust in him in all things? You know, can we not just see how excited Peter would have been to get out of the boat, to be with Jesus on the water, and to think, I've known this man, I can trust this man. But then suddenly he starts getting distracted a bit about what's going on around him in his life instead of focusing on Jesus and Jesus alone. When Peter did step out of the boat, he did so without anyone else, yes, but also he didn't first tie a rope to the boat and to himself or think, oh, I'm going to stay within arm's reach of this boat. I'm not going to go too far. I'm just going to, always make sure I'm just close enough to get back to the safety of the boat. No, he got out of the boat and trusted in Jesus, who said he can come to him. He knew in that moment right there, he didn't need the boat anymore. Now, this is where a lot of us, and me especially, are a bit different than Peter, because, I have sometimes jumped out of this metaphorical boat and been willing to get out of my comfort zone, but I always have the tendency to bring the boat along for the walk, just in case things don't work out the way I wanted to. I want to have that boat with me. I can always go back to what I know is semi-safe in the storm, what is secure, and what I know I have in my life, unfortunately, in a worldly sense. But the Bible is quite clear. It says you can't be in between. You can't be on the fence when it comes to these things. There's no such thing as a lukewarm Christian. You're either for him or you are against him. You need to get out of the boat or stay in it. But again, we can be so thankful for God's grace, because as we try and make these right decisions, he'll always be there for us and forgive us and guide us. Revelation 3 verse 16 says, "So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Just to emphasize there the part about not being able to be on the fence. Now we know how the story goes. Peter is out of the boat, he's walking on the water, he's on his way to Jesus, and then something happens. He takes his eyes off of Jesus. Just like what I do sometimes, just like what many of us do. He started to notice the storm around him and he began to sink. And the more he felt defeat, the more he started to sink, the more defeated he became. And don't we all kind of do this sometimes? I mean to follow Jesus in all the things, but then sometimes there's just something that catches me off guard, or I just can't trust him enough, or I'm afraid of what trusting him might look like. Will I be called to a place that I've never been that frightens me? Will I be called to do something that makes me uncomfortable? What we need to do is we need to realize that any place where we are with Jesus, where God is with us, is better than any place without him. Peter knew exactly what to do, though, once he had taken his eyes off of Jesus. When he started to sink, you know, he had allowed his circumstances to draw his attention away from what Jesus had offered him. The fear of the storm started to creep in, and there was a hopelessness or a despair in his heart at this moment, I'm sure. And we can all be like Peter at one time or another. Our life situations can be hard to deal with. And without this deep relationship with God, without fully trusting in him, it's easy to give in to the power of our circumstances over the power of God. But Peter had learned um, from Jesus, though. As soon as he realized that he couldn't save himself, he yelled out to be saved. He had learned from the past, from spending time with Jesus, that Jesus was the answer in all situations. He knew that he was the only one who could save him in that moment, especially. So when we are in a storm, when we are sinking, do we look around to others to save us? Do we look at the solutions of the world? Or do we look to Christ and to God as the only true answer? 1 Chronicles 16 verse 11 says, "To look to the Lord and his strength, and to seek his face always." We are given a very clear direction from Jesus in the gospel to seek God first, to always keep our eyes on him, in the way that Peter should have always kept his eyes on Jesus in the storm. And it's also the only way to know for sure that God is in control of our lives, because otherwise we think we are in control, but meanwhile, it's just a storm of the world that is bashing us back and forth. If God is in control, we know that he wants the best for us. So surely then we don't need to fear, especially even if we're in the middle of a storm. An interesting thing here in this passage is there's the storm raging, and Jesus is walking towards the boat, and everything happens, but the storm keeps raging until they are back on the boat. The storm could have probably been quietened by Jesus at a much earlier stage, but Jesus doesn't stop the storm while they're out on the water. And I think maybe that was to show that, you know, he's there to walk in it and through it with us. Peter taught me that just because I have this relationship with Jesus, it doesn't mean that the storms will stop. Jesus grabbed Peter and he saved him, and then they both walked back to the boat, still in the storm. We're being told here that we have to go through the storms. Pain It's a part of this life, fear and frustration. The difference, though, is that we have him with us. Just because we yell out that we want to be saved and we need to be saved, it doesn't mean that what we are going through is going to stop immediately. It just means that we won't be going through it alone. So when we need to handle life storms, when we need to handle stress and frustration and disappointments, we can't expect them to just immediately dissipate and go away, but we can take courage knowing that we have God with us. I think that on this boat, we sometimes think, oh, it was just Peter and, six or so other disciples, perhaps. But I think there were disciples and some other people on this boat, people probably still on the shore that saw what happened here in this situation. They saw what Peter did. They witnessed him, speaking to Jesus, stepping out and falling and starting to sink. And they witnessed what he did next. You know, Peter showed them that even when we fail, even when we start doubting, when we let the storm take control of our lives, we can call out and ask for forgiveness, for grace, and for help by putting our focus back to God and to Jesus to be right with them again. There's been too many times in my life where I've been the Peter in the storm, but instead of going to God with all the things, I sometimes will go to my friends or family first. And, we do need our friends and our family and our brothers and sisters in the truth because God does work through them. But my point is that I would go to them first thinking of a possible earthly solution instead of going to God first in prayer for him to mediate in my life. If Peter had yelled out to his friends first on the boat, would they have been able to help him at all? Could they maybe have thrown a rope out fast enough? Or, what if one of the other disciples jumped in to help him? Possibly, with a huge storm raging like that, they could have both drowned. But the bottom line is Peter chose correctly, thankfully. He chose Jesus over the boat with his friends, and it actually gave those on the boat a message that they wouldn't forget. Matthew 14:33, at the end there, it says, those who were on the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Then and there, so many of them were convinced that Jesus was the Son of God. Now, Peter is sometimes referred to as, the one who was loud and ambitious and the one who didn't trust the Lord, but, and the one who took his eyes off Jesus. But we, he was also the one who actually inspired millions of people to step out of their comfort zones, to speak up when others say nothing, to be willing to let others see his failure and to also see his success. So we need to look at Peter and see how we can take what we have failed, where we have failed in our lives, places where we have stumbled, places where we have taken our eyes off of Jesus, and use it to minister to those around us. The third and last character I want to look at today is Doubting Thomas. Uh, Reading from John 20, verses 24 to 31, it says, now Thomas, sometimes called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were closed, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Um, so interestingly, the thing with Thomas is, unlike the other disciples, there's no real record of the beginning of the friendship of Jesus and Thomas. There's no verse that says, oh, Thomas was working in the field, Jesus saw him, called him, and he dropped his things and started following him. We really just don't know when he became a disciple or what first drew him to Jesus. Did a friend bring him along? Did he learn of this new rabbi through, the people and the stories they told him and the miracles he was doing? You know, did he hear him just speak one day and find himself drawn to him by, the power of Jesus's gracious words and his parables he was speaking? Or did Jesus seek him out in his home or at his work, and call him to be a follower? We don't know. And, you know, the first mention of his name is actually in the list of the 12, of the apostles. And they were chosen from a much larger company of those who were already disciples of Jesus. Thomas must have been a follower of Jesus before he was an apostle. And he and Jesus were probably, I think, friends for some time. He would have been following him around for quite a while. And there's evidence actually that this friendship of them was actually quite a close one. There's very little uh, material and verses in the Bible available for making up the story of Thomas, but we find evidence in Thomas of a strong loyalty and this unwavering devotion. And you know, he's incredibly patient, and Jesus is very patient and gentle towards Thomas, in a way where he shows a lot more grace towards him than possibly others. Now, in the New Testament, throughout the Gospels, we get a lot of what we call word portraits. They occur again and again where, you know, we can take Peter, for example. In every mention of him, he is the same. He's always active. He's always speaking. He's always, acting. And like we said earlier, not always wisely, but in every case, he's always got the same characteristics. He's always self-confident and warm-hearted, and um, you know, we would know him unmistakably in every incident where he appears, even if his name was not given. We can think of John. Whenever we read of him, it's always this quiet, affectionate, trustful disciple of love. Andrew only appears a couple of times, but in each of his cases, he's always bringing someone to Jesus. Mary and Bethany, they come into the story very few times, but we always, think of Mary as being at Jesus' feet and Martha being always active and serving. But the character of Thomas, it's also sketched in a very striking way. And there's only really 3 incidents in which this apostle appears, but all of those, he always has the same kind of portrait drawn up of him. And it's kind of so clear, this portrait of him. You know, when we think of Peter, we know, um, sorry, Peter is barely any more well known than what Thomas is. It's so clear that there's always this adjective before his name, doubting Thomas. You'd almost think it's his first name. Oh, I'm Thomas, doubting Thomas. It's kind of sad to think of it as being the main way we think of this apostle and follower of Jesus. He's known to always look at kind of the dark side. We think of him as this doubter, but it's not the same kind of doubt that you might think, where you doubt that Jesus is the savior, but it's more kind of, it's not one of ignorance or a lack of earnest thought. It's more, he has this tendency to question and to wait for proof, which would satisfy the senses. He's got this disposition to deny. He won't deny the facts that are put in front of him. You know, he was always ready to believe, and he was always glad to believe when the proof was sufficient to convince him. But, all the while, he was still a true and devoted friend of Jesus. He was always there with him and ready to follow him, even to his death. Now, what Thomas showed me is that it's normal to doubt to a degree, but we need to use this doubt to believe. Sometimes we kind of just want to give Thomas a knock on the back of the head and say, you know what? Jesus has been there with you for 3 years, healing and performing miracles and changing these lives around you, and still you don't believe. What is wrong with you, Thomas? But in the same way, what is wrong with us? How are we different from Thomas? Yes, they may have had, Jesus there in their midst, right in front of them, but we have the Bible, we have the testimony of so many people around us for thousands of years as well, where we can see how Christ has worked in people's lives. We can read about everything he has done. So, why do we doubt at times? Well, it is unfortunately just human nature. The world is constantly pulling at us. The world is saying, believe me and believe in yourself, believe in, your own success and all these things in your money and, all those type of things. But this constant pull towards the world is a pull away from Jesus. The more our minds are full of the world, the less they are full of Jesus and full of scripture and full of the relationship we need to have with God. So it only makes sense that, we would sometimes start to doubt or question things going on in our lives. Romans 12, verses 2 says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So when we do find ourselves doubting, we need to always go back to what is right, what is righteous, to scripture, to our relationship with God. Whenever we doubt, we need to do those things twofold, to pray even more, to spend more time with those fellow believers, to be strengthened in our relationship. Thomas also teaches us that God has perfect timing for what he is doing. And we should learn patience from God's timing. Thomas had heard that Jesus had appeared, and then a whole week passes. Um, you know, and he says, I will not believe unless I see the nail marks in his hands or put my finger where the nails were. And, I would be like, okay, Thomas, let's then go out and find Jesus where he is so that you can see that he's real and that you can then believe. But that doesn't happen here in scripture. Instead, a whole week passes and Thomas doesn't get to see or touch Jesus like he wants to. What I like about this period that would have passed is that the other disciples that did believe were probably, talking to each other, saying how they had this experience and how they are so excited for what's happening and that they can finally see how what Jesus was saying and preaching is true and how he'll be resurrected. And they would have had so much more joy in their hearts, unlike Thomas. And I think he may have been, you know, getting a little bit upset sitting there for a whole week and, having this doubt, not being able to have the same joy and excitement. He probably would have been thinking, what, Jesus, if you are back, just come, show up. Let me see you. Let's just, prove to me that you are there. But in the same way, we sometimes have that kind of doubt where, we're saying, what, Jesus, if you are working in my life, if you are real, then why don't you just find me that job or find me that spouse that I'm wanting, fix my relationship, give me a raise at work, just do something to prove that you are real. Just turn these stones into, oh, wait, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Who do we sound like when we start talking to Jesus in that way, when we are doubting? What we need to know is that God's timing is perfect. And, we need to have a confident patience for what he wants to show us. He wants us to have everything in our lives that is according to his will, but everything needs to be for his purpose and not ours. So sometimes when we're waiting, it makes us get more frustrated and more impatient, and then we start having these doubts. But that's exactly when we need to be drawing closer to Christ even more. Maybe that's what God was trying to do with Thomas. Maybe he was saying, you've always been the one to want more proof, always been the one that needed extra confirmation before you would believe. So here's a chance for you to change your ways and to believe without seeing while others have. We know that Thomas would see Jesus eventually. And as far as we know, he would believe. So he managed to get his proof that he needed so desperately. But, what is our proof today? We read that, Jesus died on the cross to save us and, he protects us and loves us. So when we've read that, why is it so important that we have Jesus right in front of us before we can sometimes believe? Is it so that we can touch him like Thomas wanted to? Then John 20, Jesus says, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. So I am blessed because I was not there to see him physically. And isn't that actually a wonderful thought? You know, God, in his all knowing power, he understands and acknowledges that it is harder for me to believe because we cannot physically see him, that we haven't had this physical relationship with his son. But we're given this blessing because we have believed anyway. You know, we need to be excited that he has this understanding of what we go through as ordinary people because it is harder. And he knows that because of this, we may slip back and we might start questioning and doubting. But this doubting and this questioning that we have, it can and should lead to a desire to know God more. When we have doubt, we need to go and study more. We need to pray more. We need to improve our relationship with God more. And what I want to finish off with is that what I think is really amazing is the truth is that we as believers, as Jesus' disciples, as God's children, as men of faith, we need to be to others what Thomas was needing. Now, how great a thought that can be, where, I can be to others like Christ would have been. That someone might say, wow, I feel that I have felt Jesus' presence with me because of you. I have eaten dinner with him. I have cried with him. I've laughed with him, because we are an extension of him. We are, while he cannot be here in the world with us, we are to be like him. We are to be his arms and his hands and his feet and to be touching those all around us so that they can see Christ through us.